Welcome to Aggression and Reactivity. My name is Kate Wilson and I will be your presenter today. This presentation was created in collaboration with Caitlin Thomas. We really wanted to create this presentation to help anybody who's working with a reactive dog, whether it be in your home, in the shelter, or in a rescue, and give everyone an understanding of the road that it takes to get a dog from one side of the beginning of their reactivity to developing behavior plans and eventually give them a stable environment to live their lives. So we broke this into 4 pieces. This is 1, understanding reactivity aggression, 2, training fundamentals, 3, prevention and treatment of reactivity, and then 4, training in the real world. So the first is understanding reactivity and aggression. It's important to know when you're thinking about when you want to change your behavior or to know what you're looking at is what is reactivity? Why do dogs react? And then what's the difference between reactivity and aggression? So we'll look at what aggression is and what purpose it serves an animal in the natural environment. Aggression is a normal range of behavior in any animal. It's a behavior that involves potential threat or the actual or potential harm to another animal or person. The communication the animal uses will precede aggression in most situations because aggression is very costly for an animal. So the barking and lunging is sort of the prelude to an actual bite, being that if a dog can get away with doing a display before actually doing harm, they will for sure do a less costly and less dangerous display to end the interaction. Most aggression is to retain resources, to increase the distance of a perceived threat, and the display is really meant to prevent them from being injured. Even a single very simple fight between 2 dogs can end with infection and could end in death for a dog. So there's a lot of communication between more powerful predators that they often resort to before they resort to a physical situation. It's important to remember that it's perceived threat. So it's how the dog perceives whatever it is in the environment. This is a picture of my dad with his golden doodle when she was really little, and they took her for a walk on Halloween. And this was not photoshopped. This was a real person who decided to go out in a nightmare bunny outfit and give people nightmares, plus give this dog nightmares. So as you can kind of imagine, this dog isn't going to feel better if it just gets closer. This could easily have been, instead of a bunny, a child. So the dog doesn't, to the dog, you read its body language and you just see they're very fearful. When you get closer to the thing that's very fearful, it doesn't make them feel better. They're more scared. If she could, this dog would be out of there, but she's on leash and so she can't get away. So for some of the things that we're looking at when we're trying to decide what our dog is reacting to and what's going on, you really want to see how is the dog interpreting the situation, and then go from there. What does the dog feel about it? Some of the behaviors that you can look for to know if your dog is reacting: barking and lunging are really obvious ones, showing the teeth and snarling, air snapping, which is a threat behavior with no contact of the teeth, yelping, their hackles or their hair will raise on their back, trying to run away, or cowering in a little ball, shaking, and that type of stuff. So although this seems like a really long spectrum of behaviors that are not related, this is all reacting to something in the environment. So they're all having a physiological reaction, which then precipitates the behavior based on something that the animal has seen in that environment. So and we already kind of looked at this with what aggression is, but why are they reacting? Why do dogs react like this, but maybe goats and sheep do not react like this, and horses don't react like this? They're both on leads, they both go out with us, but you don't see the same types of behavior. Some of it is species specific. It's behavior that is used already in dogs to increase distance of a perceived threat. Each species kind of has its own sort of natural behaviors that they will rely on in order to increase their distance, increase the distance of the perceived threat, whatever it is. So it's important to remember that as long as it's perceived threat, that means it's starting to loop in sort of this physiological fear response for the animal, which includes a faster heart rate, amping the body to get ready for a real threat. So the dogs who's lunging and at the end of the leash and barking at something can have the same fear as the dog who's cowering in a little ball. The environment will change which behavior is more advantageous to that dog in that situation. And that depends on their history and things they've learned in the past and sort of who they are as a dog. So all of those things, the fear is usually tied in with proximity of that thing. So the closer it gets, the more fearful the animal becomes. There is also a group of reactivity that is animals who are having a very hard time controlling their excitement, their frustration, or their physiological arousal, and that's sort of this readiness, which would really be kind of grouped in with excitement. They usually have poor greeting behavior because the other dog gets upset and by the overexcited greeter and then responds either with its own sort of distance increasing barking and lunging to get the other dog away from it, or snaps at the last minute because the dog's so amped. The dog is so excited it can't even actually get the feedback the other dog is giving it to increase its distance or to calm down. And so they blow past all those sort of yield signs and they get right up in the dog's face. So those dogs might have the best of intentions, but it really is caused from a buildup of frustration of not being able to get there or past excitement. So dogs who go to doggy daycare and are really great in a group of 100, some of those are extremely reactive on their way into doggy daycare, because dogs represent excitement and fun and all of this stuff. So when you see one and you can't get to one, it's very frustrating, and yet your body has been amped to do something about it. So that's another type of reactivity. Those types of dogs, excitement and arousal and frustration, can also lead to a bite. Even though the dog initially really liked dogs, frustration is something that leads to aggression. So if you're very frustrated for a long period of time, if you're putting money into a soda can machine and the soda doesn't come out, people punch the machine. It doesn't make the soda come out, but it's something that happens from the frustration of not being able to get to your soda. So there's some other things that can contribute to dogs becoming reactive. One is their history. If they were dogs who were tied out or chained dogs for long periods of time, especially during their early socialization, those dogs have a tremendous amount of frustration, plus they have had no feedback from the environment to inhibit themselves in any way. So those dogs can have, when they're taken and moved to a home, the leash often represents what the chain was for the dogs where they're tied, and they transfer the behavior to what is essentially a very similar environment to them, which is being tied to something. Long-term shelter dogs can have it happen because they see the frustration of dogs going past a shelter over and over and over if they can see through their area, and their reactivity of barking and lunging and the dog keeps moving is something that is reinforced over and over for those dogs. So sometimes if they're very reactive in the shelter, it will actually transfer to the leash because that's another frustrating situation for them. Dogs that were trained using aversives can also have some reactivity, and sometimes that won't come out immediately, but what happens is that over time, as there is no longer any aversives being added, the buildup of the behavior is no longer being suppressed. The buildup was already there, the emotion to bark and lunge, but this outside punishment was preventing it from being expressed. Well, that goes down and the dog still feels the same. And so some of the dogs that are okay in one situation get moved to a home, and the home is not using punishment, and so then the dogs begin to react. There's also some things like dogs will not show their reaction when they're very stressed or insecure, and then they go to a home, and within the next maybe a couple of weeks to a couple of months, they start becoming reactive. That's also something that happens as they age. So an 8-month-old puppy might not feel comfortable reacting even if they're fearful, but as they reach 1.5 to 2, you might see them becoming a bit more secure, and then they start to react. So the environment, whether it's internal, age, shelter, that really can change what the behavior is. Behavior doesn't just exist in the dog. These dogs change their behavior based on different environments. In order to really change behavior so that it is consistent across different environments, you have to get down to the root problem, which is that the dog is upset when it sees that trigger. There's also some things that can change your perception in the world. Your genetic history can, and again, this is not like a blueprint that's unchangeable. It's a very sort of loose probability that you have a certain set of dice and you'll roll a certain set of numbers based on that. It doesn't put it in cement, and it's very attuned to changes in the environment, and the brain is incredibly adept at making adjustments as the animal has already matured. And the other one is sensory perception and pain. So pain can have a lot to do with how animals might respond to a certain stimuli, and we'll have a look at some of that. Some of the things that dogs are really good at are making the association that something unpleasant is connected to something that they see or hear or smell. Taste is not one of them. Dogs don't often react to taste. But there's certain stimuli that are very easy for them to tie their emotions into. So most of the time for our dogs, it's going to be the sight of another dog is what triggers their reactivity. And those are learning biases that have been favored by evolution to form a strong connection and very easily. So if a dog is just looking at another dog and receives a shock, they are much more likely to associate it with the dog than they are with a tree or the ground or some other a wheelbarrow, whatever is out there. They are more likely to put it onto a human or another animal, and usually a dog or a human. It can be some other things like deer and that type of thing, but really dog, which is same species aggression, and human aggression are really seem to be separate when you look at the behaviors that occur in the same dog. One does not predict the other. If you're dog aggressive, it does not predict you will be human aggressive. And so those are probably different areas of association that they've been able to learn and that were important for them to learn. And really a learning bias that's favored by evolution is something that if you can pick up very quickly that something is dangerous in your environment, you're more likely to survive. And things that are not very dangerous, like that grass for some reason is scary, that would be very disadvantageous. And so you don't want those animals making associations that are really going to harm them in the end. Whereas the human and the dog are pretty sticky experiences. One bad experience with a person for some dogs is enough to set them onto a path of reactivity, and the same with dogs. Maybe they are attacked by one or two dogs, they're reactive to all dogs. It doesn't happen maybe the same way with other things. So in essence, the sight, the audio, and the smell are more intense, and they're the ones that typically we have to work with. Taste, again, is not normally one of them, and tactile is not usually one of them. By the time they're within that range, they're not going to be reacting. They for sure can still bite for different reasons, but it's not something that they necessarily react to. In experiments, they've shown that things like auditory and taste are very hard for animals to pair as two different associations. And things like audio and being nauseous are very difficult for us to figure out. It's very hard for my brain to figure out that if I listen to this music, I get nauseous. It's crazy easy for me to think I ate pizza 12 hours ago and that's why I'm nauseous. So our brains are really designed for certain types of biases, and that's just to explain why dogs react the way they do. When I first got my reactive dog, I certainly spent many sleepless nights trying to understand why was she reacting to dogs when she had been exposed to nothing until she was 19 months old and I adopted her. She had not seen people or dogs or horses or goats, and yet she's pretty good with horses, pretty good with goats, very reactive to dogs, reactive to people. So when you're looking at behavior, it's important to remember that it's always communication, and that the environment the animal's in will change the shape of the behavior. Behavior really is designed to get the animal through a particular environment with the least amount of energy, the least amount of risk. And when you switch things around, you'll see different aspects of dogs. One of the things that we use to kind of very loosely give us an idea of the ladder of aggression is these mild kind of indicators of very beginning of stress in an animal to moderate behaviors to severe behaviors, and severe are pre-bite behaviors more. So mild would be the tongue flicks, the head turn, a shut mouth. They can blink their eyes, they can look away from you, they can walk away from you, they can sit, they can turn their body away. So they have begun to experience whatever they see as stress. By this time, we're really past where I want to do my training. I want to get back to where they're thinking better, but you're kind of losing the cognitive abilities of the animal as you climb this ladder. As we go to the yellow, we get to yawning, which is that actually the blood acidity has changed because they're starting to amp up and use more, and it triggers the body to yawn to get more oxygen, to do some more gas exchange so that you can change the pH again. A paw lift, which is the beginning of a display. Tucked tail is the beginning of a display. Panting, which is the other side of yawning. You need more oxygen to be able to change the pH of your blood. Leaning into pressure, finding somewhere to hide. Walking in slow motion, lies down, and rolls over with the rear leg up, which is also a display. So those are all still sort of avoidance displays, but now if you put more pressure and they can't escape, there's a rollover, a freeze, which is often pre-bite, an agnostic pucker, which is the demonstration of their teeth. It's considered an honest signal and that it's demonstrating the size and the health of their teeth, so if they're broken or whatever. Barking, lunging, growling, snaps, bites. These are more really pre-bite and more imminent warning where the animal is prepared for something more severe. So we'll watch this video. So we have this is little cattle dog. We have lies over with leg up and urination. So this is a display that says, please don't hurt me. And it's an appeasement display. For sure, if you change the environment, since I know that dog has fear of people, you could easily see reactivity from that dog. So we know they're already on the ladder. All we need to do now is find the environment that they react in. So here we have another dog, and this is really to remind us that it's so important to remember these behaviors are not, it's not just the dog, like in the last one with the cattle dog, it's not just that dog was doing the submissive display, and so it's trying to avoid whatever is threatening. It's that it was doing it in that situation. When you change the situation, you change the behavior. The behavior is not in the dog, it's between the dog and the environment. So here we have another puppy, and this puppy is fearful. So this puppy's barking at the camera person, fearful that the person approaches, and they start to, you see dilated pupils, you see the tail is down, they're kind of backing away, weight in the back feet. They back up, the puppy gets more confident, is lunging towards them, they walk towards them, the puppy does a lateral display, which is to show them how big they are, but they're still excited. And so she tries to escape a little bit more. As she backs up, the confidence goes up. And so we're actually going back and forth between a confident, get out of here display, and I'm scared, don't hurt me. And it's very common for dogs to be in conflict between those two different sides. So here we have another very fearful dog. So we have this whale eye, which you already know from canine body language, is fear. Ears are in conflict. The teeth are being displayed. There's barking. You can also see the dog is scared because of how far back they pull the lips. So this is called that deep V, this deep V here, and that is the fear grimace. The tongue is ready to bite, so the dog will for sure would bite, and a retracted tongue always demonstrates that to you. That retracted tongue there, right there. So why it's pulled in. And actually it was, for that dog, it was hands specifically that were the threat. So here are some behaviors that are sort of really sort of in the green area. They're kind of pre-stress behaviors. So these are innate behaviors that might occur under stress. Sniffing, yawning, digging, and super zoomy playfulness can all be things that you see under some stress. So if you are really looking to see, is the animal friendly or do they want to come towards you, I don't look for neutral, look for actively engaging behaviors of friendliness. So a loose wagging tail, squinty eyes, a loose body is a good indication, because if they're doing those things, that means their mind is in the same state. If you're seeing some of the things like they start digging or yawning or sniffing or walking away or can't make eye contact, it can be an indication the animal is under a lot of stress. and they're beginning to experience it, but maybe in the very beginning it's more of this behavior that fills the void of not knowing what to do. This is a scale that is used by a lot of rescues and shelters and trainers, just so that we can roughly give each other an idea of the risk that is being taken on if you take on a dog with a certain bite level. So in the beginning, we have this level 1, which is obnoxious or aggressive behavior, but no skin contact with teeth. 2, skin contact with teeth, but no skin puncture. Most of our bites are in this green level, and these would be low risk bites. So then we have 3 and 4, and really between 3 and 4 is where it starts to become irresponsible and very unlikely for us to find a home where that dog can be safe. So 3 and 4 are kind of more intense and do more harm, and so it's usually an indication of how upset the dog was and how confident they are in being able to make, or desperate they are to be able to make contact. So it's 1 to 4 punctures from a single bite with no puncture deeper than half the tooth. So that's still, for level 3, it's quite inhibited. They are capable of sinking their teeth in all the way. It's meant to be a warning, but it was a serious warning. And if it happens once, it's at that level or higher. It could happen in the future. 4, 1 to 4 punctures from a single bite with at least 1 puncture deeper than half the length of the dog's canine. So that's a little bit more pressure. And really that's the difference between 3 and 4, is how hard they're biting. 5 and 6 are really so dangerous and charged that that dogs who are in line sort of before them behaviorally really are the ones, as far as for rescues, that we take first, because those dogs can be adopted. And if I take a level 5 or 6 dog and put it in a home, a level 3 or 2 dog could be euthanized because their place was taken. And so it's an ethical game to really be trying to figure out what's the best situation for all involved. And sometimes you do take dogs of higher risk level, but then the management that needs to go into place, with the possibility that management can fail, can be enormous, to the point where some of those dogs are really transferred to accredited sanctuaries that are able to provide them with things they need to be safe. And at that point, we're asking ourselves about quality of life for the dogs. So before you jump right to the dog is afraid of people, it's really important to get a vet involved and to think about if it was medical. Was the onset sudden? That can be an indication that there's something that's changed recently and for the dog that is making it more defensive, and that can be a pain issue. Is it handling related? Is it just defensive when you're reaching for it, but it's totally fine in every other situation? Was it sudden, unpredictable resource guarding? So if you really have something, when you're taking the history and you say, was the resource guarding intense and sudden, that can be something that's not normal for that particular dog. And it's not normal in general for dogs to have very intense and unpredictable guarding. But guarding itself can be something that can be used as an indicator. There could be something else going on for that dog. It might appear to be in distress at a distance. It might be very slow. It might have trouble getting up. So here we have a little Chihuahua, and you see agnostic pucker, conflict, whale eye. So this was a dog that Caitlin went to go pick up in California, and no one could touch the dog in that shelter. And you see that was the tooth display. Don't touch me. That was directed at hands again, which is a good indicator there's something wrong. But you see the eyebrows here too? Dog is really worried. So it turned out that dog had a broken pelvis. And once the pelvis was treated and the dog went to the vet, the behavior of defensive behavior around handling was resolved for that dog. And that's important to remember with dogs as they age as well, because age-related pain can change behavior. So 2, understanding the training fundamentals, understanding how dogs learn and why it's important when working with aggression or reactivity. We're going to break this. This is the theory of learning, and a light look at those aspects and how they can kind of apply to us: desensitizing, classical conditioning, and operant. So there's a few methods to get a dog desensitized to a certain stimuli. For the most part, because it's the safest and it really puts us where we want to be with a dog, we use desensitization with classical or with counter conditioning. So what that means is that instead of just putting an animal in a room with a person and hoping they get used to that stranger, instead we will put a dog in a room with a stranger where the dog's not too upset and feed that dog hot dogs like crazy until it starts to associate, hey, when this man walks in the room, I get hot dogs. So that's a little bit safer, and one of the reasons for that is that with just letting him in the room with a stranger and he gets used to it, it will get you to neutral. But what happens is if that person has to get up to go to the bathroom, or they stand up, or they sneeze, the dog will go straight back to fearful and sensitive again. But if I do hot dogs, I can get the dog up here. So if the person trips or falls over or sneezes, we just go down to less loved. We don't actually drop all the way back into a fearful physical response, but just less. So habituation is something that we do with great caution, because habituation is happening all the time in the real world, but for something the dog is already sensitive to, it's very unusual for them to become habituated to something that they are predisposed to being reactive to. So dogs, maybe they can become habituated to dogs in their same household over time, but they're not going to become habituated to dogs on walks very easily. So what happens with habituation is that the animal learns it's a waste of energy to respond to that stimuli. One of the downsides of that is a very high risk of sensitizing them too. So maybe a good example might be if you go to the dentist and you're scared when you go to the dentist, but they sit there for 2 hours and they work on your teeth and they drill and all the things they have to do. And at the end of that, you stop responding fearfully to it anymore. Maybe you're back to neutral. You're just like, okay, I'm just gonna go home. The next time you go to the dentist, your reaction before you go in starts to become sensitized, and you're actually more fearful over time. So 10 times down the road, people stop going to the dentist because they're so fearful of what was a long period of kind of being habituated to some stimuli in that scenario. And the sensitization is now you are so sensitive to the tiniest little thing that reminds you of going to the dentist. So it can be the coats, it can be the building walking up, it can be the car drive over there, all of those things. You start to become hyper alert to those stimuli. Flooding is the experience that sort of when you're very, very fearful, let's say at the dentist again, and the dentist is drilling and you feel your heart pounding, you're perspirating, you're upset. But over time, your body just can't maintain that level of fear. And what happens is you just stop responding to the fear. You sort of give up and become comfortable. Sometimes it's said as they're calm. But really what's happened is that your body physically can't respond anymore, but your brain has recorded that as an unpleasant event. And the biggest side effect of that is in a dog-to-dog situation is increased reactivity outside of the flooding incident. So for example, a common method might be I have 30 dogs in a field and I take a reactive dog and I drag them into the field with a muzzle and I let that dog kind of deal with it for 15-40 minutes, and after a while the dog stops lunging and barking at the other dogs and starts doing his own thing. That doesn't fix the dog, however. In that scenario, the dog has adjusted to it because none of the behaviors it did could end the interaction, so it learned not to try things anymore. What it can do is it can make a more unpredictable dog, because as you know, that dog can still, if something happens that particularly triggers it, it could still bite another dog, and the next time it sees dogs outside of that scenario, their reactivity has increased. So this is a look at choosing your path. So one of the things that is a very simple way to look at it is deciding if there is an emotional problem in the dog, or is the dog reacting for some other behavior. So your first question is, was the dog upset? Are they scared? Are they frustrated? What's going on with the dog? So if the answer is yes, then before I proceed to changing behaviors, I want to change how they feel. So some things that you might be able to do, like I said, a person sitting in a room, a man walks in, and you just feed your dog hot dogs while the person is there. So in that situation, I don't really care what the dog does. In fact, the dog could be barking and lunging, although I don't want them to be past that emotional threshold. But you're not going to be reinforcing the barking and lunging. You're really getting to the root behavior, which is I want them to feel good. And then the other side of that is, let's say they're not upset. They're barking because they like to see moving things move. So we have like some of the herding breeds can be more prone to that type of behavior because they were selected for barking and chasing moving things. You go to operant conditioning. To reward an incompatible behavior. Engage and disengage is one of those things. A cue to make eye contact or a push or a touch are things that I can do instead of react. And we'll have a closer look at some of those. So first, let's say, yes, my dog was upset. They have decreased behavior diversity. So let's say maybe even if they're not barking and lunging, they have stopped acting happy and they have a negative conditioned emotional response. And a CER is just feeling bad. So it's a very long way to say they don't feel good. And it's conditioned emotional response negative. And so you might see that in scientific papers if you're researching, and that refers to a decrease in behavior, and overall the animal is feeling less happy about a situation. So these are our criteria, which means because the dog is upset, we're going to proceed to classical conditioning. So that means I want to pair a stimuli to decrease the emotional response. So I want to build the sight, the smell, the sound are all good things, and those associations will act as my buffer in the future. Some easy things for us to kind of add in there. These are all natural reinforcement options. And then there's different ways to do it. So food, sniffing, novelty, play, running, sex, air, and breathing. Some of these, the last two, are clearly not ones that I'm going to withhold or give to a dog in order to reinforce behavior. But it's important to remember these are innate things that are important for a dog, and they do reinforce behavior from a dog. So choice over their interactions, control over their environments, their space in their environment, their attention, affection from other species or from their own species, and things like water. That's just a short list. It can be anything. It can be going through doorways. It can be rolling in the grass. All of those things are options for your reinforcement. Food is super handy for us, and if it's trained at different locations, animals can eat in other locations, but sometimes for a dog, sniffing your toys are higher value than food. So it really depends on the dog, and ultimately the dog will decide. This is a situation where I trained one of my foster dogs to hate his crate by accident. So this is a conditioned emotional response for fear. Before I started the training, he really loved hot dogs and he was very fearful of a crate. So he had been on a 10-day quarantine and isolation, and he did not want to be alone again. He had really crate confinement issues. So during the training, he ate hot dogs, and then we went to the crate. So what happened is I'd go to the refrigerator, I'd get the hot dogs, he'd see the hot dogs, and then we go to the crate and start training. So what happened is the hot dogs predicted the crate training. After my training, he actually was afraid of hot dogs, and he was also fearful of the crate. So what happened there? Because it's not just the ingredients of how we train, it's the order that those things occur. And that's a very important aspect when you're trying to change an emotional response. Because he had the hot dogs and the hot dogs predicted the crate and he hated the crate, therefore he hated hot dogs. So I'm going to show you another example. This is when it's done correctly. So this is to create a positive conditioned emotional response. So before the conditioning, the dog loves hot dogs and he was a very motivated lab and he was very fearful of people. So during his conditioning, he saw a person and then he ate hot dogs. So people predicted hot dogs. After the conditioning, he loves hot dogs still, and he loves people also because they predict hot dogs. So again, the order completely matters in how the dogs form the association. The prediction of one of the other changes the emotional response of whatever the stimulus is that predicts the thing they like. So in our training, we will use, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, we're going to use a sound or a clicker or a yes, and that can actually pinpoint exactly what I want to have happen for that animal. So here we have an alligator and I touch her and then feed. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to get her to enjoy being picked up. The stimulus of being moved is being paired with something good. So before this, if I touched her, she'd swim away in fear, and it took a little while to get to this point, but it's a demonstration of how that can work for even something like handling. So let's say we started this intervention and the animal reaches a point where they're not upset anymore, but they're actually happy. Once that happens, we go back to our training path. So now, is the dog upset and I've worked on it at that distance? And the answer is no. Then we follow this other path. They're not upset. They have an increase in their behavior diversity. So I'm seeing a lot more behavior, and they have a conditioned emotional response positive. We're going to move on to changing their behavior then. So this is important to remember, behavior is driven by consequences. So for the animal, the reactivity serves the purpose of increasing the distance from that object. But what do they do in the future when they see that? Is there another behavior strategy that we can use that will work for them? So here are a few examples of different animals who are doing behavior, and then there's some kind of consequence that occurs from that. So for the horse, it's a treat. For the alligator on the bottom, he opens his mouth on the deck and you toss food in. And the same Sophia, she opens her mouth and she gets a treat. And for Harper, she touches her nose to the target, the cougar, and she gets a treat. So all of those situations we use food because food is so easy for us to dole out in small amounts, and the animals eat already, and so we can shape behaviors quickly like that. So in order to really be very precise, and this is the difference between sort of classical sort of training for association and training like a surgeon for a behavior that you want, we use event markers. And an event marker tells the animal the exact time that their behavior is being selected for. So it's also called a bridge, and it's really bridging back to the behavior I wanted the animal to do. An example might be I ask an animal to sit, or I lure them into a sit. As soon as their butt hits the ground, then I give them some event marker or bridge and then give them their food. So what that does is it makes it a little bit less messy, and it makes me be able to train much faster. Some common markers that we use: a clicker, a yes, a whistle, a hand signal, a touch for a dog who might not be able to see or hear. It just has to be some stimuli that tells that animal what you just did was correct. So we're going to get into a few concepts that are going to help you with working with your reactive dogs, and helped me tremendously with my first reactive dogs, where I was trying to figure out how to train, but also what was happening and why we were having inconsistent episodes of reactivity. So first, this is what would be sort of a breakdown of 4 quadrants. And this is a very rough look at different ways of training and some of the emotional outcomes for those. So we have positive reinforcement. Good things are added to increase the behavior that I want. That's mostly what we do, and that reinforces behavior. And animals like their behavior to be reinforced by the environment. So negative punishment, good things are removed. Animals don't like good things to be removed. So anytime you start to go away from positive reinforcement, you pull a little bit of the conditioned emotional response away from where you're trying to go. So then we have positive punishment. So bad thing is added to reduce behavior. Animals even more don't like this, so they have a negative emotional response to this. And then you have negative reinforcement, where I remove something bad to reinforce the behavior that I like. And this is also a dangerous thing. So all of these, kind of these 3, 2 on the bottom, and negative punishment, all carry with them the side effect of the animal being under stress, which will change how the animal learns, and it will change their association with you. So those are used with great caution. If I implement those in a plan, it's really in a huge cost benefit. And I never have to use something that would be like a painful or scary or unpleasant for the animal in order to punish or negatively reinforce, because you're creative enough. If you want to reinforce, I can use positive reinforcement, and if I want to punish, I can use negative punishment. So you really, the second half is redundant, plus it carries a lot of risk. It doesn't mean that's not happening every day in an animal's life, but the more severe forms, and especially ones that cause pain or fear, are they really will shoot you in the foot in the long run. It's also important to note that even though I have food, play, and attention in here at the top as reinforcement, that's just kind of my experience and my general observation, there are for sure many animals who being touched is not one of the things that's reinforcing. And for sure, I have seen animals that you hand them food and they look away with disgust. So it's important to remember that your animal is the one who is going to decide if the behavior is reinforcing or if it's punishing, if it's one of those things. In essence, those things themselves mean nothing. What it does to the behavior dictates what it means to the animal. I want to look at aversives quickly because I already mentioned they have some side effects that are unwanted. So one of those side effects is that it has higher rates of aggression in many different studies with many different species, including people, that when you add something that is unpleasant that the animal can't escape from, or if you add something to reduce behavior, they start to form an association with things. And so you get higher rates of aggression and sometimes handler-directed aggression. Easier time redirecting because you're the source of the stress in some of those situations and they know that. You get suppression of the behavior, so the behavior decreases. And I have a dog who has stopped barking and lunging or chasing rabbits, but they still want to. And I was using some visual behavior to get to know when the animal was going to react, and that behavior was suppressed, and so my warning system was suppressed. You get weird effects on fear. You get fear generalization. So let's say a dog was punished for barking and lunging at dogs, and now they're fearful of that corner of the street or the park or the dog park. So fear generalizes really quickly compared to good emotions, which unfortunately do not generalize very quickly. It's much safer in nature to assume something is going to be dangerous and live another day. You get escape and avoidance behaviors. Escape and avoidance behaviors are things that are motivated by anxiety. So the animal is under pressure and it does the behavior to stop the anxiety. You get something that's a bit insidious, which is learned helplessness, where once a dog has been trained over a long period of time with something that's aversive, they stop trying. And one of the things with early studies with learned helplessness they found is that even the dogs who were in those studies, you took them out of the studies and their behavior was different. They no longer tried things. One of the other strange things about it is that it doesn't last forever. So you have a dog who's in a puppy mill, they won't try to escape, they'll never try to get out of their crate. These are dogs who've never had options and they learn that nothing they do works or gets them out of where they are, and so they just don't try. But it doesn't last forever. After a year or 2 years of work, some of those dogs can regain all of those abilities and start letting behavior happen again, because behavior is a natural and it's a type of damming up, but the brain is very adaptable. You can actually have physical effects. So we grew up in a time when a lot of trainers, more that I was exposed to, used a range of aversives, and I saw things like puppies' eyes detached from choke chains, and so they would become blind. I had a dog personally who was paralyzed from his first foster home, and this is a picture of him, and he was dragging his feet because he can't pick them up all the way, so he had to have them wrapped so that he didn't have open sores. So he had a choke chain and had been given a correction on the neck, and a lot of the larger breed dogs have fairly delicate spinal cord and neck issues because of how big they are and at the rate those things grow. And so when he was 1.5, he was paralyzed for almost 6 months from that injury. You get some weird behavior effects on yourself. So a huge dependence on punishment. You can't stop. And overall, you're always waiting for a behavior. So it's anxiety provoking for the person, but relieving after you've given the punishment. And you feel you can make behavior stop, even though over a long run it might be increasing. So an example might be my dog barks at the neighbor and I squirt it with a squirt bottle. The dog stops barking. I have a huge wave of I made that happen. But over time, if I watch, the dog can actually be barking more and more every week until it's barking almost nonstop. But that effect will be sort of masked by my personal reinforcement that I made the behavior stop. And so it's important to remember that we are not outside of the area of training and that we can also be trained by the perceived control we have over the environment. And it makes us a little bit unbiased and unobjective when we're taking data. Here are some common behaviors, methods used, potential fallout, and then the alternative that might be able to give you the same outcome. So in a shelter environment, dog bites the leash on a walk. Some ways that we've seen it being reduced, which would be positive punishment. The handler shakes a penny can. The handler gives the dog a leash correction. He yells or verbally corrects the dog, or he or she, I should say. Some of the potential fallout from that. Let's say the behavior did decrease, so it was a true punishment. The dog can actually become fearful of handlers. It can become fearful of leashes. Now that it can't bite the leash, the dog might still have the need to bite, and it turns around and bites a staff's leg, which is for sure, we see that happen. It can redirect on the handler, another person, another dog. I've seen them redirect on a chain link fence. The leash was doing something for the dog. And if I pull the leash out, the need is still there. Sometimes you can actually cause injuries to the dog. But really the biggest injury for potential fallout is that you have a dog who bit the leash, and now we have a dog who's fearful and might bite a person, which drastically reduces that dog's adoptability and puts someone who does adopt it in a situation where they either have to continuously correct the dog, reduce its behavior, and that will only work for so long for those dogs. So some alternatives: if a dog really has the need to bite, you can give it a soft chew toy. You can change the meaning of the walk so that it's not nervous and overly excited by using treats periodically as it goes through the kennel. I can increase the time that they're outside the kennel working on those things. I can change how I walk past dogs in the kennel and make sure they have a ton of other mental behaviors to engage in besides that. You can even toss treats on the ground every few steps to give the dog something else to do. So the thing with food is it's a little bit calmer activity than the toy, and I go to food first because it's not as compatible with over-aroused leash biting, and it often gives the dog a great thing to do that it really likes. And that can completely change what a leash walk means, and over time you can just increase the distance between those treats. So the other, which is very common, is that your dog is barking in the kennel at passing dogs. Some common things they might do is hitting or rattling the gate, allowing the dogs to fight through the fence, handler yells or verbally corrects the dog, a spray bottle. Those would be things that you would try to do to reduce the behavior of barking and lunging. The reaction is the dog becomes more reactive as the fearful stimulus was already the dog walking by and now it's intensified. It can transfer to people. The dog can shut down in the kennel, which means it's under a ton of stress and it's going to come out in some other manner. And all of those are really the worst probably is now the dog is insanely reactive to other dogs and will go out of their way to try to get to the dogs. But that plus transferring it to a person are really the two things that put the dog's life in danger. Some alternatives that work really well when I worked in the shelter is I would walk by and toss food over to the back of the kennel so the dog would turn around and eat that food, and I would just keep walking. Over time what would happen is that the dog learns that when you walk by the kennel there's food that's going to appear in the back. So giving that dog a really like that or a type of enrichment with a box that it can open, a Kong that it can mess with, covering the front for people who don't want to walk around tossing food everywhere. You could just simply cover the front of those kennels in really high traffic areas. Play music to reduce the barking of the other dogs to kind of help them. And it's been shown that music is something that can reduce barking in a kennel environment. So here's a look at one of the other concepts I said would be important, and this is threshold. So threshold is the distance that the dog is starting to physically react in some way. And in this picture, you can see this dog is starting to physically react to the other dog. The beagle down there is just eating its food and ignoring it, but we have this other little guy who's dropped his head, his mouth is shut, he's making eye contact, his body's a little bit tense. He's already over his threshold, and there's food available, and yet he's ignored the food that was presented to him. So here's the guy, and actually you can see the leash is already being pulled back because the handler knows he's going over threshold. So over threshold is they've begun to experience something at a higher emotional level, and it's not where we're going to be doing most of our training unless it's by accident. So another concept I want to talk about was trigger stacking. So stress from several events can start to accumulate and change the dog's perception. So coming from a shelter, having a vet visit, reacting to a dog, a thunderstorm, fireworks, having separation anxiety, sound phobias, all of those things can accumulate and produce behaviors if they occur over a short period of time, that are not typical of that dog given one of those stressors. So let's say this was a thunderstorm, here's the fireworks on the 4th of July, and now this is a dog reacting. So initially, if this was a week apart, none of these would send the dog over this reactivity threshold here. But if they occur all at the same day or within the same couple days, we have our thunderstorm, our fireworks, and then a dog barks, you get reactivity where you normally would not have seen reactivity. And so this can lead to feeling that there's an inconsistency in how the dog's behaving. Here's a look at what the cortisol is doing. So cortisol is a recovery hormone after you've been very stressed, but it can have a big effect on the body when it's not dissipated effectively. So trigger stacking is when you have higher levels of this recovery cortisol, which is associated with stress, and every time there's a stressful event, you get this peak and the body's recovering from the stressful event, and then you go over, this is your reactivity threshold. So you drop below that and then you continue to recover. But if it happens too many at a time, so we have, let's say, our thunderstorms, we started to go down, but then let's say we had fireworks, we're up here, we start to go down, a dog barks at us, it can take hours for a half-life for it to drop down by half. So going to the vet, having somebody come over, all of those things can start to change your dog's behavior. Most dogs will typically show their reactivity to be more extreme at night. Or after many stressful events. We get a lot of calls for dogs who had a bite, and those bites usually occur around the holidays when there were a lot of visitors and the dog was doing okay maybe the first 3 days, and on the 3rd day someone reached for the dog 8 o'clock at night and the dog bit. So that's a look at behavior, what it is, how behavior works. Now let's look at prevention and treatment. So we kind of know how they learn, but what's the kind of the protocol for prevention, treatment, and management safety for those dogs, and then a look at why we care so much about the threshold. So when you get a young puppy in, what can I do to set those puppies up for success? Who's at risk? So here's a dog who is at risk. This is a dog who has energy enough that when someone walks by, it jumps 4 to 5 feet in the air. It has to be in a covered kennel because of that. Dogs who are jumping very excitedly, even if they're not barking and lunging, they're already ready to be a dog you need to intervene because they're at risk for that. They've already begun to react. They're just not at barking and lunging yet. But they're under physiological stress. And remember, with stress stacking, too many things happen in close proximity and the animal starts to be it's not recovering anymore. And physically, that can do things to the body like shut down the digestive tract and cause ulcers in the intestines. So spinning and circling, which is an access energy, and then trying to find some behavior to soothe, the inability to settle, so they're never calming. That means they're under a ton of stress in the shelter. They're never really sleeping. Heavy panting, which is that their body is very amped up, and so they're exchanging gas really quick. Hypervigilance, never able to kind of calm down. Again, these are all chronic stress situations. And dogs who are stimulated or excited by motion. And what that will do is cause frustration. Where you place them in the shelter can matter. So if you work in the shelter, having a map that's available for intake staff that shows this is a nice low stress, and these are dogs who might be more resistant and can handle the high stress kennels where a lot of people will be walking by, or maybe even strangers are coming in and feeding the dogs. Those dogs need to be able to handle those situations. If you see a dog declining there, move them to your low stress kennels. Dogs that move quickly to high stress, dogs that I know are going to be adopted very quickly, those dogs can handle a high traffic a little bit better. Dogs who might have a longer stay then I need to make sure that that stay is something they can survive. So finding a way to do that. And I try to space dogs out. If you only have 5 dogs in 10 rows, put buffers between them. The smell, the sound, they really do know there's another dog even though they can't see it, and it can help reduce some of the stress. Have super simple training that can be done for the fearful dog. So this is one of the really fearful dogs that was in the shelter, very fearful of men. And there's just a bucket and it says, please toss me some treats. Toss for dogs who can't eat by hand. You don't want dogs running up and eating by hand unless, like this dog, you have a low wagging tail and you have squinty eyes and the dog's really focused on the food. Eating by hand is not the goal. The goal is that the dog likes people. So there's some things that you can do to make it very easy for staff or volunteers to start the training with that dog to change their association. If I have a dog and I'm working on prevention for puppies and for dogs who really don't have any issues yet that I've been able to ascertain, I want to give them that safety buffer zone. I want to reward them for new experiences, something they haven't tried before, or they look a little bit like, I haven't done this. I want them to be successful with me. Meeting anybody in the shelter environment or in rescue, you want this dog to be as human friendly as possible. So every single person that they meet, they can get treats for. You want them to have a good time. If they love affection and watch their body language, that's a totally sufficient use of a reward, but it isn't always for every dog. And it's important to remember that affection and talking to them and even acting happy can be a punishment for a dog. So watch their body language. Meeting any new animal, if they walk through the lobby and there's a rabbit in a cage and they see the rabbit and you reward them, they are less likely to be able to attack a cat in a home. Exploring anything new, exploring a novel object, and then any handling or grooming. So if I have to go to the vet, even the dogs who are really good with it, I still feed them to the vet. If they get their shot, I still give them food for that. I want to favor it so that everything is in this dog's favor, that if it gets into a home, it's had this kind of inoculation for behavior problems. When you have a reactive dog and you have to pass in the kennel, or I have a dog who's not reactive yet, but I don't want them to worry about walking past reactive dogs, get as much space as you can. And you can see in this photo here, it's a very narrow alleyway that you have to walk past. So in those situations, I move the dog's head away from the other dogs by feeding it away from the other dogs. I make sure I have good contact with the dogs, either 2 points of contact or a leash to both the martingale and some body harness so the dog can't pull out of it, but it doesn't just pull on just the neck. Use really high value treats. You get a lot of dog food and things like that donated, but I want better than what they normally get. There is a law called the matching law, and animals, as you would expect, are able to remember how valuable the food was and what the stimulus was. So if I got popcorn for letting the mailman come to my house, that's great, but I'm going to remember much more intensely when I got chocolate for letting the mailman come to the house. So your memory will record the type of treat that you had in the situation that you did it. And a lot of dogs are under a lot of stress in the shelter, and they're not going to take their typical like hard biscuit. So using something like cheese or something that's really good, especially for those dogs. And for some, they will eat anything, and you can experiment with that to kind of decide where your dog is. Keep your exposure as brief as possible. Don't linger in the hall. If I'm walking past a reactive dog, I walk very steadily but hurriedly past those dogs in a relaxed manner so the dog has something else that he's doing. And then I avoid other triggers. I always look through the doors, make sure you're not just going to walk your dog right past another dog. That's where accidents happen in the shelter. Start your enrichment program. So one of the things and one of the reasons that reactivity can be so insidious in the shelter environment is that the dogs don't have other options for their behavior. So there is really over time, while we're trying to really preserve dogs' mental state and that impoverished environment, just like a lab animal, really we've turned to enrichment. And enrichment is anything that stimulates a natural behavior for those dogs. So stuffed Kongs, stuffed paper towels, enrichment boxes. You can look up enrichment online for shelters. There is just endless, very inexpensive, easy to do behaviors you can help stimulate for those dogs that reduce reactivity. And some dogs, we've even had them sort of recover from aggression or reactivity in the shelter because they had something else to do. So here's a picture of a very aggressive parrot who was biting, and this amazing owner gave this bird, who had grown up essentially in a very sterile cage, this entire room filled with things to do. And they don't know how to use them at first. So you have to realize it's sort of baby steps at first. You really are trying to stimulate the brain and they allow the animal to engage in natural behaviors, but they themselves don't know what they can do. And so it has to be piece by piece and things that they really choose to do. And I pay attention to what the animal is actually engaging in and what they are not engaging in. So here's one of the highly reactive puppy. And other dogs are barking and being walked past her kennel, and normally she would be going crazy, and she's the one actually who was jumping up and down in the first picture. She's like 5 feet in the air. Well, now she has boxes within boxes within boxes full of dog food, and there's little chews in there, and there's all of her food is hidden through there. So in the early morning when you're doing a rotation, or in the evening when dogs are coming back in from outside, it can be a good time to use one of these enrichment things. And you can see it's not just getting the food, it's ripping the box. If it was just the food, then they wouldn't be so excited about the opening. And what happens is that ripping and opening is a natural behavior, and so that feels good. And it totally replaced reactivity for her. And there's been a few dogs where the turnaround was that dramatic. It went from barking and lunging and hurting themselves on the fences to, great, I'll play with this box instead. So what do you do if they're already showing their reactivity? So in order, if you're in foster, if you're trying to do the training in a shelter, or if you adopted a dog and they already have shown you that they have some reactive behaviors, there's some tools that you need to make sure you keep your dog safe. And you're really trying to prevent your dog from biting another dog and putting your dog at risk. That's one of the reasons that people either are so stressed out that it's not doable anxiety-wise for them, or that their dog gets bites on their record and there's involvement from the local community for that type of thing. So 2 points of contact, and those are 2 separate places. So one of them might be onto like a collar, a martingale collar if your dog can slip out and has a little head and a big neck, a harness, a body harness. And those don't make the dogs pull. It's just something you can kind of attach so that when they pull, they're just prevented physically from pulling, but I'm reducing how unpleasant that stopping is. Muzzles for dogs who have the potential to bite or have been. And I muzzle anybody who has the potential because those bites go on their record, and I feel I'm truly doing a disservice to that dog if I allow that to happen. Choosing appropriate locations and times. So if you have a reactive dog, you already know there are some times that are just terrible for training. And one of them is when children, or if you have one who's afraid of people or kids, the school bus drop off in a busy area could be really inappropriate for that dog. If you have a dog who doesn't like other dogs, places where people take dogs off leash can be really problematic for you. So being smart about your setup. It used to be thought, great, expose them to what they're fearful of, but that's not it. I need the animal comfortable and training in the outside environment before I even start exposing them to those things. And when I do expose them, I want them to be in order to reach neutral to happy, I really want them in as close to neutral as possible, because it'll make me getting to happy a lot easier. The more relaxed they are, the easier it is for them to record a memory. So remember your reinforcement options. You have your high value food, and that's things like cheese and meat and boiled chicken. You have sniffing, which is reinforcing because it's exploration, and you'll see a lot of dogs actively engage in that. But for that to work, there has to be things to sniff. So a concrete pad's not going to do it. You really need to have more natural environments for them. But that's something that, for sure, sniffing and engaging in the environment that way helps them process information somehow. toys. You can see here we have this little Akita mix, and it has a stuffed animal, and it's working on reactivity with a stuffed animal. That dog in particular is over threshold, but essentially the owner is working with toys because she didn't want to use food. Novelty, some dogs love new stuff. It's something that children work for too. A lot of these things have been applied to children. So something new and fun, or the opportunity, parrots love it too, something new and fun, the opportunity to really mentally explore something they've never seen can be one of those things. Going to a new area, somewhere they haven't explored yet, can be one of those. Play with you is something that they can do. So for one of my dogs, he plays like a sumo wrestler, and so I don't really play with him unless it's for recall, because that's his favorite. I want that to be the strongest. He wants to do that more than anything, and so I use that reinforcement for that behavior. Running away is reinforcing. It does the same thing as barking and lunging, and that it gets rid of whatever the trigger is. So remember, running away is really the opposite of reactive behavior, because if they can run away, they have a great behavior they're practicing that is not aggression. So choice and control over when they're exposed to it and when they go back to that. Their space, how far away they are. If they'd like to move away, always follow your dog away from something they react to. Attention from you, affection from you, and when they go and get a water break. If we're training and I'm like, let's go get some water, and we move away from the target, I was going to give them water anyway, but now they're moving away from the target to get water. So there's things you can do that line up your reinforcers to help with the behaviors you want. So here we have toys being used with this dog, and this was a Mega E dog, which means they can't eat food without being in a chair. So his reinforcement is the ball. And he was working on his relationship with other dogs in the home. So here he is in a long line, so he can't get any closer to her. She's a little nervous, but she's okay. She doesn't have a history of aggression with other dogs. He had to look at her in order to get the toy. So he looks at her, yes, he got the toy right away. So she predicts toy. And so because you couldn't use food for him, because he can't swallow food without being in a special chair, you can tap into any number of other reinforcement that will still power the behavior. Usually toys are not my first because it gets the dogs highly aroused. And if I don't have a toy, they're aroused and they still need somewhere to put that energy. When you're deciding which reinforcement you want to use, for any given animal, there's hundreds of things you could use for their reinforcement, but some of those things will be practical and some of them will not. But if you plan ahead, you can decide what you're going to use. So on the top here with this little Brittany, we have food. The dog eats in lots of locations. The food is very practical. She trained it really well. It's a wonderful dog. And so food is a really great, easy way. Food doesn't work for all dogs, and sometimes you actually have to train a dog to take food in a new environment, and you do things like give it a treat and throw a frisbee. So what happens is eating the food is reinforced with the toy. So there's things you can do to make food a little bit more available depending on what it is. So and over we have a bicycle on this dog right next to the spike. Exercise can be one of the things that's reinforcing. It can be pretty hard to dole that out in appropriate doses that have some kind of connection to a stimulus. So although it's really reinforcing, you have to think about how are you going to use it. Maybe you could use it where you run two dogs together at great distance and you're watching the body language, and as the dogs are relaxed and happy, you kind of close the distance carefully. Not only that, but something like biking with a dog is not for everybody. Then you have things like a toy. So at the bottom here, we have one of my pity mixes, Rufus, and he has a flirt lure, which is a stick with a toy on the end, like a cat toy, and he's chasing it in a circle, trying to catch it. So he's doing that as part of his training for his reward. So I can have him maybe hop hoops or look at another dog or whatever I like, and then boom, his reward is that he gets to chase the toy. So that's another thing. And that might not be practical, say, if I'm training in a vet office. So you have to really consider what you're going to use, but don't limit yourself necessarily to food. All of those things are available, but I usually start with food because the concepts are hard to come by, but as you grow your skill set, you can start incorporating more and more different types of reinforcement. And the last one we have is this is a blind shepherd, and we're getting this guy, he was blind, and so he didn't know what he was biting, but he was startled easily. And we're getting him used to a muzzle. So the muzzle goes on, and then actually in my hand there I have spray cheese. So I switched the type of food based on, I needed it to go through the muzzle, and I really want it to last a little longer. So things like spray cheese and peanut butter work a little bit better than None of that. So teaching foundation and safety cues, recall, wait at doors, emergency U-turn, the watch me, push in place. Those are things that it's nice for the dog to know because it helps me manage the real world. And when we get down to real world training, we're really where I need to move the dog in the real world in a way that makes my training opportunities successful. If I just train until the dog is over a threshold, then I really fail because the dog will record that as a negative experience. So recall is just come, dog's name, whatever you want the recall cue to be, and they come to you and they get a crazy awesome reward. And I practice that in many environments. And when you're training it, you can kind of see down here, we have someone practicing their recall with a reactive dog. And here is this little boxery guy, and he's got a long line. So it's not unsafe, and that the dog could actually get into trouble. We're training in a free zone where there's not a lot going on. And you really want that dog to be successful each time you recall. You're really trying to build that behavior that it's amazing everywhere. I also want them not to dart outdoors, just in case your neighbor let their dog off leash and they're right outside. So there's things like you open the door and the dog runs back 4 feet, and then you can check both ways and you're like, okay, let's go. So you can work on areas that you might see could be problematic, train any behavior you want. That's really the fun part. That's sort of your pre-foundation stuff for reactivity. The emergency U-turn, where I'm walking down the street, I see a dog coming right towards me off leash, and I say this way, and we just turn right around and walk the other way. Dog gets a treat for coming with me. So you can see this right here is a this way. So the dog heard the this way, and it did not poison the relationship at all, and that the dog did not associate anything bad happening with the dog. It just showed up. It's just the dog got to practice running away, which is not aggression, and it's paying attention to you. So it trusts the handler to be able to take care of it. And then for dogs who are reactive but not upset, things like watch me, push, place, touch are other behaviors the dog can do that maybe it has a really good reinforcement history with that are really calm, and it help it kind of handle itself in those situations where it might be reactive. Again, before you kind of proceed in this direction, make sure that pain is not adding stress. You don't want the animal feeling vulnerable. Things like a torn cruciate can make animals more likely to snap, a tear in their knee or their hip, because they can't get away as fast as they used to. Make sure that if you have a very active dog, that they're getting their physical and mental needs met. It's sort of unfair to ask a dog who is really designed to run for 12 hours a day to do nothing for 3 days in a row and then go train reactivity. So they're bringing a lot to the table in that way. And so I try to make sure that I'm truly meeting the needs of that dog in terms of enrichment and their physical and mental needs. I want to make sure that when the dog is home, that it feels safe. And so there can be things you can do, like put up sort of window film so they can't see things. I don't want the dog reacting at home because that's when it's supposed to be recovering from the training. It's supposed to be going home and feeling safe there, and then it knows if it goes home there's always a safe place. It's very important for any animal in captivity. It's the same thing with the animals in exotics. They have a safe place they can de-stress because those places allow them to recover from the stress of the environment. So again, environmental enrichment. I want puzzle toys, food hunts, Kongs, things that access their mental needs, positive reinforcement training. And then for a lot of our dogs who need predatory outlets, so flirt pulls, fetch, tug games, dissection where they're ripping up the boxes, and then hunting and seeking where you can essentially just do like an Easter egg hunt for them with toys or with food. So before you start maybe changing what the thing is, can I change the order of the thing? Could I move my UPS drop-off box to the end of the road instead of training the dog that when the UPS man comes, it's great? That's fair. There's a lot of things in life that I don't have to train the dogs to do. Some of them I do have to train the dogs to do because I can't avoid them, or I think I won't be able to avoid them sufficiently. But there are plenty of things that I can avoid, and it's actually more humane to avoid. It doesn't mean that this idea of training is that every dog needs to conform to what I want it to do. And it's really teamwork with your dog. You really adopt a dog into your house not to be a little robot that just does what you want and does all the things that I imagine it can do. It's more looking at what that particular animal can do. Where are their strengths and weaknesses? And is it fair for me to put them in a situation where I know they don't have the skills to be able to navigate that situation? So it's sometimes that's unavoidable and that will absolutely happen. But other times you can avoid it. So in this situation, I had a dog who was afraid of the shower because he was unable to stand for long periods of time. This is the paralyzed dog. So he couldn't stand in there, and so he was afraid. So instead I filled up a bathtub and then brought him, and I got in the bathtub with him so he wouldn't be afraid. So in this scenario, he's super happy. He's drinking the water. This took care of my situation for that particular dog. So that's what's called antecedent arrangement or my management. And management is foremost even before you're training, because while you're training new behaviors and changing probabilities of new behaviors, your management is what keeps animals safe. So choosing the setup, you want an environment where unleashed dogs don't run up, where kids don't run up, you don't get chased by people, you want the other dog under control. The worst thing that could happen is that your helper dog is also reactive and they're both getting traumatized. So practice in a safe and controlled environment where the dog can be successful. And that's what this is as a reactive. We have a reactive dog here, we have a trainer here, and these guys are working off of Rufus as he's walking past. Remember that with the best of intentions that I have of where I would like to start, my dog really tells me where I'm going to start. I may have been able to train at 10 feet away from a stranger one day, but if you show up and your dog can't make it past 20 for whatever reason, and I don't know the other stressors that contributed to where that dog is today it's going to be 20. So remember to watch the dog and train at that level. It's the same thing with human therapy. You don't just jump from one to the other. You really go at the rate of the emotional response that's triggered inside of the animal. So here is some highly reactive dogs in a reactive class, and this is their first day. They know there's a dog here, right here, very reactive puppy. There's a dog here. And we have here, there's a group of dogs and a trainer. There's actually one here that's much more, needs more distance, and some people walking up. So in this group of reactive class, there's people and there's dogs, and the distance these dogs have to be varies depending on the day and depending on their history and depending on the dog and how they feel about it. So the handler's job is to work on behaviors the dog can do completely under threshold. And you can kind of see here, actually this dog is named Rocky. He's a great dog with a great connection with his handler. Overall, he knows there are dogs here. It doesn't matter to him how close they are. If they're close enough that he can react to them, then it's going to be recorded as a bad experience. If he's sitting at this distance with this person, he knew there were dogs here, and the dogs had nothing to do with how much fun he was having. That's the lesson that they should be able to take away from reactivity, because as you close that distance, they can start to do that at 10 feet, at 5 feet, and they start to realize, like, I have all these things I can do that are fun, and you guys don't matter. But in order for it to start that ball rolling, you have to figure out where the dog can start with that in mind. So a few things to think about if your dog's not upset, but frustrated, excited, confused, and they're not having so many problems. So if you're kind of in this path and you said no, and you're like, okay, so I want to work on, and we kind of talked about, right now we've talked about your reactive dogs, yes, they're upset. And we said, no, they're not upset. When you're working with reactive dogs, you're often going back and forth between yes and no. So yes, they're upset at 100 feet, but I trained at 100 feet. So now, no, they're not upset at 100 feet. But yes, they're upset at 50 feet. So we work on it. No, they're no longer upset at 50 feet. And so then we keep going back and forth and back and forth. That's a large portion of reactive dog training. But let's say they were never upset. So what do we do then? So here's a reactive dog. He's reactive to strangers and dogs, but he's working on strangers today. So now he's looking at me because he's not that upset. He's not upset at this distance anymore. So he sees her, but he looks at me because he's thinking stranger means look at you. So really what I've done is replace what the meaning of the stranger means. It doesn't mean rush up to the stranger and go and engage with her. He's thinking instead, seeing a stranger means check in with you. He's going to go see her. The leash simply stopped him from doing the behavior, and he was instantly reinforced. And then I also added petting, because petting for him is also reinforcement. I would use toys, but you can't use toys with a muzzle for a dog. He has 2 points of contact. Every time he looks at her, he's getting a treat and pet. And actually those little pauses in there at this distance, he's had enough training. I'm waiting for him to think about things a little bit. And I'm actually, so there's using scratching a little bit as another reinforcer. These are behaviors that we've already done in this environment he's comfortable with, so that I know I'm not just applying on brand new behaviors that have no meaning to him. If he looks at her and he looks back now, I'm kind of going back to, great, so you looked at her and you looked back. That means you can handle it and you're not upset. He looked at her, looked back, he got a treat for that. That means he's not upset. If he can't look back and he keeps staring at her, he's upset. I count to about 3 for that. So if he looks back and he's like, there's a stranger, 1, 2, 3, and he hasn't looked back at me, you can mark that and feed that. So this is a little bit, this is along lines of the first example. This is the dog who was truly upset, and we're going back and forth, as I mentioned at first, back and forth between operant behaviors and classical conditioning. And truly, it's important to remember those things are never fully separated. When I'm training a behavior with food, I am also contributing to their emotional state if I use positive reinforcement. And that's one of the reasons that we've really shifted in that direction, is that how the dog how it feels dramatically influences the shape of the behaviors that come out of that individual. If they're really happy, they're far less likely to show aggression, because those things are not compatible. So this is a long training session, and I should probably move him out. I've been walking in a circle, walking in an arc, not walking straight towards her, and I'm kind of there. So I'm starting to move him away. I'm probably not going to follow that advice to move him out. So he just offered a behavior because he wasn't sure what to do. He spun in a circle. Because he chose that behavior in that particular time, he's actually not upset. He's thinking, how do I get treats now? What do I do here? How do I get treats? That's a great place to be in for a dog, because no longer are they being so stressed out and confused by the thing that was triggering their stress. They're starting to do other behaviors thinking, this is not important anymore in the environment. What I really want is how to get food. So he's asking for, he's barking a little bit, he's spinning in circles and that type of stuff. The main thing here, so this is the distance that he is, and he started off with barking and lunging very intensely at even 200 feet with people. So it's been a long time working with him with strangers. But now what strangers mean is they mean fun training, they mean choice, they mean all the reinforcers that he has available to him. And it's, maybe it's something that we don't think about, but the behaviors that you practice are the ones that become more prevalent. So if he mostly sees people and he is relaxed and he is doing fun stuff, he's getting food for seeing them, he's looking at them, looking at me, and that type of thing, then those dogs will remember that in the future. So the last bit is training in the real world. So everything else is in sort of training setups, and let's have a look at where do you go from here? So this is what we were just demonstrated with Finnegan. This is that was the last dog that we looked at. This is engage and disengage training, and this is the same thing I did with Finn and that the stranger. And this is another dog doing it with turkeys, who he massively bark and lunges at turkeys. So even though he's not upset necessarily with turkeys, engage and disengage also reinforces calm behavior around turkeys. He sees a turkey, he looks back, he gets food. The important thing, you think I could just feed the dog for looking at me, but one of the things that happens if I just train a sit and eye contact or to ignore the turkeys is that when he does look at the turkeys, he hasn't trained at that criteria, and so he then lunges at the turkeys because he hasn't been looking at them. I really want him to look, engage, and disengage and reinforce that, because that's a more realistic problem skill for the real world. You're not always ignoring things. Some things actually get through your radar there. So you just saw Francisco had to touch his neck because he wasn't paying attention to the reward marker. That means the dog was slightly over threshold. That was better. So he recovered from that. He's under threshold again. Good. So it's important to remember when you're trying to set up the real world, there are a few things that are going to be important about the thing they're afraid of, and we call that the trigger. So the duration, which is how long they look at that thing, matters. The distance, how far away that thing is from your dog, matters. And the distraction level. Was it a person on a skateboard or was it a person sitting on a bench? That matters. So when I'm training, I start to get a feel for, is this going to set my dog off? Is this within their abilities to train, or is this past their abilities? The engage and disengage train that you just saw with Finn and I, and with the last dog that was here with the turkeys, that's something that's very easy to look up online. There's some great handouts that have been made for how to train and engage and disengage. And it's something that works really well in terms of exposure for the dog and kind of dancing the line between changing the emotional state and training a new behavior. And so it's very easy to teach, it's very easy to use, and the dogs usually pick up on it really fast and they really enjoy it. It's that's why it's used so widely. There are so many things that you could train. It's really a matter of what's easiest for us to learn and what's easy for the dogs to learn. So that helps them feel good for the trigger, and it also takes care of if I'm training accidentally over threshold, I can just feed my dog and move out of the way, or I can use my emergency recall and get out of there. So it's important to have your safety behavior strong enough so that I can use them when I go over threshold. So things like run away, games to train, alternative behaviors, and things like that, in order to kind of keep control of where those things are. So here is a dog who's not upset by it's not upset by skateboards, but it's stimulated by the motion. So I want to keep, because it's a high level trigger, I want to keep my exposure brief. I want the level of management in between training sessions. I don't want people walking up and seeing him. I'm going to use a high value reward for that dog. I want to start where the dog can train, is not stressed and uncomfortable. And here is Detroit Dog Rescue working with one of their dogs who was skateboard reactive. So you can see I'm working far behind the level where the dog might start to react. He's just there, he just noticed and he's eating. The person stopped at that distance. If we proceeded, we might have got a bark and lunge, but we're still not there. So the dog has seen the person on the skateboard, getting food, practicing a behavior besides barking and lunging. So here we come again with a skateboard. Actually, the dog at that distance was so under threshold that he was like, what else is there to do? So that's not a bad place to be. It means I can certainly increase the distance. I can make it a little bit shorter. And I can add a level of distraction. So here's kind of setting some things up. So before this was taken, this dog barked and lunged wildly at vacuum cleaners. And so what I would see in those scenarios is the movement of the vacuum cleaner would cause the reactivity. And it was not so much a fear as stimulation by motion, sorry. So the proximity, the sound, and how fast, and that type of stuff. So that'd be the distraction level for that. Putting it all together, the vacuum cleaner is on. So he's getting treats for proximity or any intensification. Again, I'm just setting a basis to reward incompatible behaviors with something that he used to do until the vacuum cleaner massively represents an alternative behavior for the dog. And so that originally at any distance in the house would have caused the dog to run up and start attacking it. But over a few weeks, the owner was able to record the sound of the vacuum cleaner on the phone, reintroduce the sound, reintroduce the motion with no sound, combine the phone with the motion, and then finally the whole package came together. So it's important when you're trying to set up these situations in real life is to really know the area you're taking the dog. Move at your dog's place. When you're thinking about which route you're going to take, is my dog upset? I really want to go back to changing their emotional state before I train the behavior over that dog. I have seen dogs walk perfectly in a heel, making eye contact, walk right past the trigger and lunge and try to bite them. So you can train over the warning signals with operant just like you could with punishment. You really want the dog processing the information and being reinforced for a behavior that we deem safer and behavior that really sets them up for better welfare in our care. Make sure you have the proper training tools for that. When you're training, I don't want to make the behavior worse. We sort of have a do no harm in dog training where anything that I apply needs to improve the welfare of you and the dog, not add unnecessary risk to the dog. Start an enrichment program. Enrichment has been shown in many, many studies to drastically improve animals' mental health. And in some cases, especially in shelters or impoverished environments, their reactivity is tied in with lack of other behaviors in their repertoire that they can kind of pull from. If you have any concerns about the aggression, don't hesitate to contact your veterinarian, someone who specializes in behavior, or a certified dog trainer. Find a trainer who is certified through one of the avenues that fully vets and make sure that punishment is not one of the things that they use, positive punishment, shot collars, choke chains, and prong collars, as their in their behavior in basic training. There's no place for those anymore, being that we have the technology to do everything we need to without them. And then management at home while you're training, so that the dog's home is a safe place. You don't have to feel like you need to keep the front window open so they can watch the dogs walk by. That's really intensifying your reactivity while you're and works against you, sort of shoots you in the foot while you're working on those things. So kind of review for everything that we have covered here. You kind of got an understanding for what reactivity is, what it does for animals, what's the purpose of that reactivity, what it looks like for them, the training fundamentals, what are the basic rules for how animals learn, and how do we tap into that to reprogram our dogs to be able to move around in this world without aggression and fear. How to step in very early and prevent and treat reactivity very early, or once the very beginning signs of it have developed, and then an idea to get you started on what are some of the challenges of training in the real world. And all of these, there are so many more topics, and obviously feel free to email with questions. We'll answer to the best of our abilities. And thank you very much for attending this seminar.